Welcome, everyone. There's a lot of people who wouldn't be caught alone in a room with a single psychologist, but you've all shown up to sit with 4 of them. So, congratulations. So I want to welcome everyone to this event, and thank you all for turning out in such huge numbers, and thank all of you outside. You can wave. Thanks for sitting out there as well. So I'm Sean Reardon, and I'm one of the co-leaders of the Poverty, Inequality, and Education Workshop, which is a year-long workshop that's going on at the Graduate School of Education here. And we, the Poverty, Inequality, and Education Workshop, are co-sponsoring this along with our partners, Education's Digital Future, which Mitchell Stevens runs. Both of those are funded through the generosity of our dean, Claude Steele, who's on the panel tonight. So thank you, Claude, for making it possible for you to speak.
Yeah.
Yours is up there.
I've been waiting for the invitation.
I think so. Yeah, I put both. She put. I
roundabout
put
Every time
way
you
to do it.
invited me. You know.
So before I introduce the panel, I just want to tell you about a few upcoming events that are part of this workshop in case they're not on your radar. So this winter, the Poverty, Inequality, and Education Workshop is focusing on developmental and psychological processes as they relate to poverty, inequality, and education. And so we've had a number of great speakers on that topic, and we have 3 more coming in this quarter. Next week, next Tuesday night at this time, Leah Fernald, who's a professor at UC Berkeley and the daughter of 2 of our Stanford faculty members as well, is going to be here. The week after that, Hiro Yoshikawa, who's a professor at NYU, is going to be here. And he's going to be here on Thursday night rather than our regular Tuesday time. So if you're keeping track at home, make sure you come on Thursday to hear Hiro talk rather than Tuesday. And then the last week of the quarter, Sibel Raver, who's also at NYU, is going to come in and be part of the workshop as well. So that's what we have the rest of this quarter. The schedule for next quarter is not entirely set, but next quarter is going to focus more on questions of what schools can do to address issues of poverty and inequality. And so a couple of the people we have coming are Greg Duncan and Dick Murnane, who have a new book out on successful strategies that schools can use. David Kerp is going to come from UC Berkeley and talk about his new book. And then we also just confirmed today that Anna Deavere Smith, the prize-winning playwright and star of TV and movies, she's been working for the last year on a new piece about inequality in America, particularly as it relates to education. And so she's going to come here and do a presentation of part of that work and then have a discussion with the group kind of about what she's learning about inequality in education in America through that work. So we'll announce the dates and the schedules of all those things on the website. There'll be a bunch of other things happening in the spring too, but just to give you a little bit of a taste, that's where we're going in the spring. All right, and so let me just turn it over now to the panel without further ado. So the panel is the 4 psychologists I would most like to be stranded on a desert island with. So it's 4... psychologists, after all. So, but they're developmental psychologists, which I think is what saves them, because they teach us a lot about human development and how children learn and grow, and how, I think what distinguishes the work of the folks on the panel is they're really interested in how conceptions of the self and identity interact with the environment to shape people's behaviors and their life trajectories. And so I'm going to let Deborah Stipek, who is going to moderate the panel, do the introductions of the full panel members. So thank you all for coming.
No.
No. So I'm going to use this one. Now, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, Sean, I just want to let you know that any more psychology jokes, and you will be hearing all of my economist jokes, even though you're a sociologist. So, that's enough on psychologists. So, I have the honor of introducing our panelists this evening. I'm not going to tell you about their honors because if I did that, we'd never get out of here. And I'm actually not going to tell you what they do or what they study because you already know. That's why you're here. And if you don't know, you're going to find out directly from them. You don't need to hear me. I will mention a couple of books because I know it could improve sales, and I know my friends would be very happy about that. So our first panelist is Claude Steele. He's the I. James Quillen Dean of the Graduate School of Education. He's also a professor emeritus in the Department of Psychology at Stanford. He has a recent book called, get your paper and pencil out here, Whistling Vivaldi, How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do. And what I'd really like to know is how Claude had figured out how to write a book while he was serving as provost at Columbia. Must have had a lot more free time than you have as dean here, I gather. Carol Dweck is the Lewis and Virginia Eaton Professor of Psychology. She's author of many books. One of them is called Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. I don't know whether it has hit the top of the New York Times bestseller list, but I do know that my nephew, who as far as I know has only read 4 books in his entire life at the age of 27, sent me an email the other day and asked me if I'd ever heard of this person, Carol Dweck. He'd read her book on Mindsets, and it was really cool. Geoff Cohen is the James G. March Professor of Organizational Studies in Education and Business. Geoff has the distinction of having published not 1, but 2 articles in Science. And for those of you who don't know, that is the gold standard in academia, and all of us are deeply envious. Well, maybe not all of us, but I am. So all 3 of our panelists are actually social psychologists, but they do study children. And Carol actually is a developmental psychologist, just to be very rigid about it. They're very highly regarded as scholars. They are about as prominent in the field of academics as a scholar can be. But I think what makes them special, at least from my perspective, is that they are deeply committed to using the tools of their discipline to address some of the biggest and most significant challenges that the society faces. So we are extraordinarily fortunate to have all 3 of them in the room at the same time. And I really hope that the ceiling doesn't fall in, because it would do a big dent to the field of social psychology if it did. So everybody hold your breath. And I'm going to ask Claude to come up and speak to you. The plan for this evening is that each of the panelists will talk for about 10 minutes about their work. And then we will have a conversation among the panelists, and then open it up for questions and comments from the audience.
Great. So I guess we do need this. This doesn't work.
Even though we're wearing.
Or I can talk without that. Oh, cool. Great. Thank you. This is a fantastic room. Well, thank you, Deborah. I appreciate that. And I forgive Sean all of his psychologist jokes. We'll get back at him someday. In trying to connect the research that I've done and been associated with to poverty and education, I thought I might wind up saying a few relatively more abstract things at the beginning to help make the connection between that kind of work and really psychology in general to the effect that poverty can have on learning and school performance and functioning in school. So I'm going to say just a few more introductory things than I'd normally say. I suppose there are a couple of points I want to make. Psychology matters, and it's frustrating that sometimes it's very hard to measure it in the ways that we'd like to measure it and just show that there it is, it's having a big effect. Often you do have to do more nuanced experiments to get at the phenomenon, the nature of the effect. I also want to make the point that identity matters, and I know that is, I wish that weren't true, but our social identities, our social class, our gender, our race, these things actually do make a difference, and I'm going to try to show how through their effects on our psychological functioning they can affect our performance in schools and the like. So those are the couple of big themes that I want to hit. I want to begin though with this abstract notion. I want to offer an intellectual tool that is a finding in social psychology. It's called the actor-observer difference, and it tries to capture how we explain things differently when we're functioning as an observer of things, an observer of people, for example, compared to how we explain things if we're the actor, if we're the person ourselves, how we explain things. There is a very systematic difference in the kinds of explanations we come up with when we're in one or another of those roles. When I'm an observer looking at a student, I tend to explain the things about them, their performance, their functioning, in terms of things about the student. That's what's in my line of vision, my brain's line of vision, so to speak. And the explanations I resort to tend to be the explanations that have to do with something about that person. That's what makes sense. They have some deficiencies, they have some motivational differences, they have some cultural orientations. I could even go into biology and so on, but my whole litany, my paradigm for explaining how they function in a school situation would tend to drift in the direction of things about them, characteristics about them. However, when I'm an actor, when I'm the child, him or herself, I don't see the child. The child is not in my brain's line of vision. What's in my line of vision, when I'm functioning, are the things that I have to deal with, the circumstances, the conditions, the people, the events, the timing, all these sorts of things. So when I explain why I do well or not well, I resort to a whole different set of explanations. An everyday example is if I'm late. Someone else might look at me if I'm late and say, well, Claude is late because he's always late, and there are things about him. Maybe he doesn't calculate this correctly, or maybe it's a deep cultural thing, or who knows what. You know, the list could go on. But when I say I'm late, I was late because this happened, and that happened, and this happened. I have a whole different set of circumstances which I use to explain things. And I'm not for a minute arguing that one perspective is always better than the other perspective. That's not the case here. But I think in trying to understand especially the connection between poverty and educational outcomes, we take too often and too exclusively the observer's perspective. And we tend to focus on features of the child, and we don't see the world so much from the child's perspectives. So the two pieces of research I want to talk about today, I hope illustrate what could happen, a different kind of explanation you'd come up with if you focus on the child's perspective toward understanding school, their experience in school. One of these areas is my own research on stereotype threat. I'll mention that a little bit, but first I want to talk about a work that isn't mine. It comes from this program of research by a behavioral economist and a psychologist who've actually joined together to do what I think is a great program of research on scarcity and the effects that scarcity, both scarcity of money and scarcity of time, have on our psychological cognitive function. And I want to argue that it helps us explain that connection between poverty circumstances and performance in school. They make a very simple argument. If you take the actor's experience, suppose you're actually in a poverty, a very disadvantaged circumstance. For example, they look at Indian farmers who are farming a small plot of land before the harvest, and it's usually just one person, and they have to pull all this together and get up every day, day in, day out, make this work, and there's a great sense of urgency, and the effect it has on their cognitive functioning is to focus them in very tightly on the things that they have to do today, because they've got scarcity of both resources and time, and so they don't have time to think about things outside that very narrow tunnel of life. There's a hyper sense of urgency about that. And Mulanathan and Shafir give them an IQ test at that point, and they find that they don't do that well on it. They're rigid, they can't really take into consideration the complexity of the circumstances, and they just don't have the alacrity of thinking that you'd like to have. After the harvest, in the few weeks after the harvest, when they've gotten paid, they're not working so hard, they have more time, they have less scarcity of money and less scarcity of time. You give them the same IQ test, and their IQ test goes up dramatically. Their performance goes up dramatically. This was another science paper this summer. Well, that's a good example of, you can almost think about what that would mean for a child coming to school. from a very disadvantaged circumstance. We're very good at documenting all of the disadvantages that kids have to go through, really from an inner uterine to their arrival at school, and what poverty will do to that. Unstable family structures, not as much vocabulary exposure, relationships complexities, danger in the environment. So there are a lot of urgencies that tunnel in attention and don't allow space for an appreciation of the value of schooling and its connection to long-term outlines and long-term goals in life and the like. It can make those things seem just like way out there. That's just got nothing to do with me. Just as a function of the urgency and disruption in life that is growing out of their circumstances. They haven't put this implication of their theory to test. They have put it to test in a lot of different contexts like handling money and in particular, and handling time. The book is a great book to read because all of us experience the scarcity of not having enough time and how that creates this tunneling of attention, this neglect, as they call it, of long-term consequences and so forth. We can focus on what we've got to get through the day, but it's really hard to consider the long-term implications of things way out in the future, and so we function in this relatively tunneled way. But if you have a child who lives in circumstances where their family structures are unstable, the income is, all of the instabilities, the urgencies that go with coming out of poverty, and you arrive in a classroom, you can very well see that the tunneling, the effect of that experience on their cognitive functioning is going to be to over-focus them, make them much more less appreciative of things that may be of clear value to us as observers looking at them. Why don't they understand how important this is? Why don't their families understand how important this is? But in the context of that urgency, there isn't the bandwidth. Maybe that's a good term. There just isn't the bandwidth to incorporate that. So that's a perspective, that's one kind of an analysis you get from taking an actor's perspective, what it's actually like to experience the circumstance that we're talking about, as opposed to looking at them on the outside and kind of leaving it at that, hypothesizing, conjecturing about that. I think Stereotype Threat is another good example of that. I think one way to put it is that, well, Stereotype Threat, to just give you a working definition, warm that up again. It's just being in a circumstance or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant to you. Could be any of your identities, your religion, your age, your race, your gender. Any circumstance in which an identity, a negative stereotype is relevant to what you're doing at that point, you know that you could be judged or treated in terms of the stereotype. And if you care about how you're going to do, if you care about performing well there or functioning well there, the prospect of a mistake being taken as evidence that the stereotype about you is true can be very upsetting and distracting. And if it's there in a walk of life, or an entire walk of life, it can deter you from taking that particular road in life, because you just don't want to live with that level of kind of pressure or discomfort or whatever. There must be some more reasonable way for me to function than to be here. So that's again something that I think you get from thinking about the experience as an actor, as somebody who's an experiencer, who's actually experiencing a situation. What are you worried about in the situation? Well, I'm worried about how they're going to see me. How are they going to see me? At any point, they could. I'm just tired of worrying about presenting myself, whistling Vivaldi, and doing various things so that they'll see me the right way and not see me the wrong way. We all deal with this circumstance in one way or another, but you can see that it is something that makes a situation, a classroom, very different for some people than other people. Very different for people of one identity than it is for people of a different identity, even though everything in the classroom is exactly the same, and even though there is not one iota of expression of bias or prejudice in the situation. Let's assume that. There's none of that in this particular situation. It could still be experienced very differently by people of one identity than by people of another identity, if it's a situation in which a negative stereotype about one of their identities is relevant in that situation, then they are going to have to or feel like be trapped into contending with that stereotype and deflecting its impact on deflecting them being seen in terms of that stereotype and their opportunities and experiences being affected by the possibility of that stereotype. So it seems like it's a very abstract thing. It seems like it's just a psychological thing that you just ought to be able to push right through this. But it's actually a very structural thing. There is, in a society, you have a greater probability if you have a given identity to be judged in a particular way than people with a different identity, and that becomes part of your reality, and that's what makes that situation, even though it looks exactly, objectively the same, a very different situation for one group than it is for another group. And I have the personal suspicion that until we understand these aspects, we're going to endure the kind of achievement gaps that worry us so much for a long period of time, that we're going to have to begin to, that the opportunity for breakthrough in these problems that we care so much about are at one big category of opportunity of breakthrough is at the psychological level, the social psychological level, understanding the experience of the classroom as a function of these things, stereotypes, the effects of pressures on cognitive bandwidth and the like. So I could go on, but probably my 10 minutes is up. Am I up? Good, Doc? Good. So there are, growing out of these analyses, one last point I want to make is that one of the very heartening things, and I think you are going to about to see some great evidence of this in our next two speakers, is that if you do address these psychological issues, if you address them sometimes with interventions that seem to be quite minimal and almost magically minimal, you can have very dramatic effects on performance and educational variables that you would never think would be so susceptible to such change. So I think the thing you need to keep in mind when you experience the interventions as magical is that they're touching the right nerves. They've found where the issue is, and they're sort of touching the right nerves, and that's where the effect derives from. Anyway, I'll stop at this point, and Carol, you're next.
I'm not going to get to that for a few minutes, so. But you can memorize it in the meantime. My career has been devoted to the question of helping, the issue of helping kids thrive in the face of challenge and adversity, especially students who are laboring under negative stereotypes, students from underserved minorities. I've asked, what are the psychological factors that help kids fulfill their potential under negative conditions? And can I bottle what I find? Can I bottle the remedy and dispense it to everyone? In my research, I've found that there is a potent psychological factor that affects students' achievement, and it's their mindset. It's their belief about their intelligence. There are others, but this is the one I have focused on, and we'll hear about another one later. In my work, we find that some students believe that their intelligence is just a fixed trait. They have a certain amount, and that's it. What happens when students have this belief is that they don't want to do hard tasks. Might make them look dumb. They don't want to work hard. Makes them feel dumb. If you're really smart, you shouldn't need effort. They run in the face of errors because errors mean they're not smart. When we follow these kids over difficult school transitions, the transition to 7th grade or to college, we find that they perform more poorly than kids who have a growth mindset, than kids who have the belief that their intelligence can be developed through their efforts, good strategies, and good instruction. Students with a growth mindset don't necessarily believe everyone's the same or anyone can be Einstein, but they believe that everyone can develop their abilities. In the last, 8 to 10 years, we have begun to wonder whether we could intervene with kids, teach them a growth mindset, and whether this would change their level of engagement with school and their achievement. In this study with largely minority students in New York City, we took students who were entering 7th grade, well, not entering, they were in 7th grade. Many of them were already showing declining achievement, especially in math. We divided them into 2 groups. One group got 8 sessions of great study skills, ones that teachers said they really needed that year to do well. But the other group learned a growth mindset along with the study skills. They learned that every time they pushed out of their comfort zone to learn new things, every time they did really hard tasks and stuck to them, their brains would form new and stronger connections, and over time they could get smarter. They learned how to apply this to their schoolwork. What you see here is that the students who just learned the study skills continue to show declining grades in math, whereas those who learned the growth mindset with the study skills showed a marked rebound in their grades. Good, Aronson and Inslicht, other psychologists, replicated this work with Latino students in Texas, showing higher achievement test scores in math and verbal for kids who received training in a growth mindset. Recently, a group of researchers undertook the studies I'm about to tell you about. Dave Paunescu, David Yeager, Carissa Romero, Greg Walton, and Geoff Cohen was involved in some of these. We wondered, would this work in high school? Many economists say it's too late. You have to pay them or you have to focus on younger kids. Many educators at these schools said, don't bother, go help younger kids. But what we did in this study was we recruited 13 high schools around the country and sent interventions over the computer. So students went to the computer lab for several sessions, and they got online training with a growth mindset and how to apply it to their schoolwork. The control group learned all about the brain and how they could use it to enhance their memory. Let's see what happened. Well, the first thing I want to tell you is that the effect was strongest with the lowest achievers. We were really excited about this. The students in the bottom third showed a significant and substantial gain in their GPA only 2 to 3 months later. We also have been sending online interventions to community colleges. Community colleges are, as you know, a pipeline into higher education for many students of color and students of poverty. And yet, the graduation rate is usually dismal. We taught kids a growth mindset, about the skills they would need, the intellectual and the sort of navigating your environment skills that they would need to succeed in community college. And again, we compared that to the brain and memory control group. Oops, okay. What we found was, when we looked across all the students in the intervention, again, a nice increase in GPA, overall GPA, for the students who received the growth mindset intervention. But even more interesting, we then focused on the students who were in remedial math. Many of the students go to remedial math. It's kind of where community college students go to die, because most of them never get out. It's a prerequisite for graduation from community college, and if you have any hope of moving on to a four-year college, you need to pass that course. What we found was that those who had the typical dropout rate and the dropout rate for the control group from their remedial math course was 20%. Those who got the growth mindset intervention, for them, that rate was cut in half. And the final study I want to show you, I'm going to tell you about more studies, but I can only show you one more because we were limited to 5 slides. This was an intervention at a high-quality 4-year university, public university, one that has a pretty large number of minority students who typically do not make it past, who often don't make it past the first year, often don't carry a full course load the first year. And carrying a full course load is a very strong predictor of ultimate graduation. As part of their orientation, students, half of the students were randomly assigned to have the growth mindset intervention, half were assigned to have the control material. So they went online to do their orientation, and between where they should go to get their vaccination and where they should sign up for this and that, they were sent to a site where they had the growth mindset intervention or the control intervention. So what we see when you look at all students was a small but significant increase in those taking a full course load, more than 12 credits. When we look at the African American students, we find a really substantial 10% increase in those who were taking 12 or more credits. Again, a strong predictor of ultimate graduation. And that 55 is getting awfully close to the 61% of the all students. We also have a line of work that looks at how adults praise children, how a growth mindset is instilled or a fixed mindset is instilled in a student's environment. We have found that when adults praise students for their intelligence, it puts them in a fixed mindset and makes them vulnerable. They don't want to take on hard tasks and they don't stick to them. But when adults give kids process praise, praising them for effort or strategy, for focus, for perseverance or improvement, praise them for the process, it gives them more of a growth mindset. It says that skills are developed through engaging in these processes. These kids then take on difficult tasks and stick to them. Recently, I collaborated with researchers at the University of Chicago they had tapes of mother-child interactions over many years. So we coded mother's praise to their babies. By the way, these kids were representative of the population of Chicago, so many, many underserved minority kids. The tapes were coded for the kind of praise the mother gave the baby when the baby was 1 to 3 years of age. What we found was that the more the mothers gave process praise, the more the child had a growth mindset and a desire for challenge 5 years later in 2nd grade. And just last week we found that that growth mindset and desire for challenge in 2nd grade that grew out of the praise was now predicting the child's achievement in 4th grade in both English and math. So these mindsets that get instilled early, it's never too late to change, but the way we socialize them can be very powerful, and the impact they have can also be powerful. I want to close by saying I grew up in the era of the IQ test, where there was a prevalent belief in fixed intelligence. My 6th grade teacher seated us around the room in IQ order, and we knew it. And we were already the top IQ class in the school. So my challenge to you is this: what kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to be a society that classifies and sorts children, or do we want to understand the factors that will help all children fulfill their high potential? Thank you. Would you tell me if it wasn't?
So thank you everyone for being here. Thanks to Sean and Deborah for organizing this this conference, and thanks to my co-speakers Claude and Carol. It's just a delight to be here, and I'm really excited to for us to have a conversation and to share some of the work that we've been doing. To start off, what I'd like to do is to abstract out 2 key lessons that were implicit, if not explicit, in the previous talks. And these are lessons that we all hope will begin to penetrate educational policy and practice more in the future. The first point is that different students can experience the same classroom very differently. So even if the objective classroom is identical, same teacher, same instruction, same curriculum, the experience of that classroom can be radically different for different folks, whether it be a community college student or a minority student, individuals who are vulnerable to threat or belonging or insecurity or self-doubt. They have a very different subjective landscape for experiencing what happens in the school. And that subjective landscape can create disparities in motivation and in learning. So that's the first big point that we hope you all take away from here, and that we hope begins to saturate the education world more generally, so that when we see a chronically underperforming student or chronically misbehaving student, we don't jump to the conclusion that it's something in the kid, but instead understand that it could be something in their experience of the classroom that repeatedly recurs. The second point that I want to abstract out is the idea that it is possible to harness psychology for educational gain. And this is increasingly the message of a lot of social psychology. It's been shown that timely interventions aimed at key psychological processes can, in the right time, in the right place, have effects that are not only large by intuitive standards, but that also persist over surprisingly long periods of time, as Carol's presentation illustrated. I guess for me, I'm less interested in the brevity of the intervention, but instead in the ideas behind the intervention, a lot of which come from simply observing success stories out there in the real world. To take one example, Mark Lepper here in the psychology department has done a lot of research looking at expert tutors. Now it turns out that expert tutors are among the most effective educational interventions out there. Most educational interventions, if you have a 0.2 or 0.3 standard deviation effect on student learning, you're golden. Expert tutors consistently have produced educational gains of 2 standard deviations.
What's an expert tutor, Geoff?
These are, thanks Mitchell, these are tutors that come highly recommended from the schools or that have been observed to be effective with children. They come highly recommended from the schools.
They're human beings.
They're human beings, yes. Thank you. Thanks. So what Mark does is he observes these expert tutors in action, and it turns out that they're very attentive to student psychology. For example, whereas inexpert tutors will sort of jump right into business and just start the lesson plan, the expert tutors will spend a lot of time getting to know the kids, asking them about their hobbies. And from an outsider's perspective, this seems like inefficient. But from the perspective of the student, it creates a psychologically safe place where challenge and approaching difficulty is something they feel safe doing, especially if they're at risk. These tutors are also very Socratic. 90% of their utterances are questions rather than statements, so the student feels as though they're generating the knowledge themselves. The tutor's almost pulling it out of them. And the tutors are also subtle in that they, instead of using praising students' ability, instead to maintain their encouragement, what they will do is say things like, the next problem you're about to do, it's very difficult. I don't know if you'll be able to do it. I might not be able to do it. And what that does is, from the perspective of the student, it creates this attributional safe zone so that now I know as a student, if I try and I fail, it's because of the difficult nature of the problem. But if I succeed, that's doubly affirming of my potential to learn and grow. The basic point is that these tutors, which are among the most effective educational interventions, they don't do one thing, but they do a lot of small things that speak volumes psychologically to the kid. And so those are the 2 big lessons, that it's possible to leverage psychology and that different classrooms, different students can experience the same classroom differently, and that's also the source of a lot of educational inequality. So what we try to do in this research, and this is work with Carol, with Greg Walton, with Julio Garcia, David Yeager at UT Austin, Val Purdy-Vaughns, is to try to kind of pull out and bring into sharp relief what effective educators are often doing out there in the real world, to kind of distill it to its essence, bottle it perhaps, and then disseminate those interventions out there back into the classroom so that educators might reach more children. So I'll give you 2 examples of this. One, these are just sort of examples that I'll sort of look at from a bird's eye view, is wise criticism, and the other is values affirmation. There are several other types of psychological interventions. And what they do is to address the experience of adversity in the classroom to make it less threatening. They all help students to sustain a narrative of themselves as adequate and able to succeed, sending this message that you can do it, you belong, you are valued. Okay, so wise criticism. In this study, we were working with 7th graders. These are middle school students, and these are 2 little pilot studies. And all we did was to have the students submit an essay to their teacher. It was an essay about their favorite hero. And then students received critical feedback, specific feedback from their teachers on what they needed to do better, how to improve their essay. And it turns out that this actually is an interesting topic unto itself, that students are often getting less critical feedback on how to improve than they should. So in this module that we created, we made sure that the teachers were providing good critical feedback. And there were 2 conditions. One was a control condition where the criticism was given and the teacher had some generic comment up front. But in a second condition, we introduced something that we hope changed the students' experience of that criticism. So the teacher wrote up front at the beginning of the criticism, the reason I'm giving you this criticism is because I have high standards and I believe that you can reach them. And what this does is it changes the meaning of criticism so that now from the student's perspective, that actor's perspective, the criticism isn't a condemnation of my ability, but is instead an acknowledgement of my potential for growth. And the critical nature of the feedback is an affirmation of the teacher's belief in my ability to reach that higher standard. And most teachers actually don't use this kind of message when they provide feedback spontaneously in the real world. Here we introduced it. There's a lot of details under the hood that I'm sparing you. It's randomized control studies. Teachers were kept blind to condition, and you can go into detail on that later. For white students, the non-threatened group in this context overall on the whole, if we look at the percentage of students revising their essay, 75% did, and that didn't vary by condition. For black students in the control condition, 17% did, but for students receiving that message of high standards, that percentage jumped to 71%. In a subsequent study, we looked, actually, maybe one thing I'm going to say about this is that this effect surprised us because in one respect, the manipulation or the intervention is so small. But it got us to thinking that that's the point, that what psychology and social psychology is telling us is that what seems objectively small may actually be subjectively very big from the perspective of the student who's under threat, worried if they belong. This message might be like water on parched soil. It might be something that kind of gives you a foothold and makes you feel as though you belong and can reach the higher standard implicit in the criticism. David Yeager went to an urban school. This was a more impoverished school. To make a long story short, he taught students to reinterpret criticism from their teachers as representing their teachers' high standards and belief in their potential using a sort of internet-based platform similar to the one Carol told you about. And here we're looking at the percentage of courses that students failed. For white students, there was no effect of conditions. I'm just collapsing the data for them here just for ease of presentation as I did above. 14% of their classes they failed for white students. Black students in the control, 43% of their classes they failed. But for black students, now taught to reinterpret criticism as suggesting their teachers' belief in their potential, they failed only 23% of their courses. So in addition to being subjectively powerful, one other aspect of feedback in the classroom is that it happens over and over and over again. Just as threat or stereotype threat rears its head over and over and over again. It has compounding consequences because it repeatedly recurs. And so little interventions can have large effects if they're timely and if they affect that kind of interaction that repeatedly recurs as the feedback interaction we think does here. Okay, values affirmation, I'll sort of quickly tell you about this. In this study, what we did was to try to introduce a sort of moment of identity, positive identity assertion in the classroom. Students, on the day of the intervention, early in the start of the year and then throughout the year, the teachers passed out an assignment. It was presented as a normal classroom assignment. In this assignment, students had the opportunity to pick out their most important values. These were 7th grade middle schoolers, a sort of fork in the road where too many adolescents take a turn for the worse. So we were wondering if we could kind of interrupt that downward spiral with a moment of validation. And what we did here was to, in the affirmation condition, students had the opportunity to write about their most important value. And in a control condition, they wrote about a neutral topic. And now I'm sparing you the details, but critically, the studies were randomized controlled trials with folks blind to hypothesis and condition assignment, et cetera. So here's an example of the kinds of things students are writing about in this affirmation exercise that they're doing at the beginning of the year, much like what the expert tutors do when they're meeting with students to kind of get to know them. Here, one student writes, "Dance is my passion, my life. My second home is the dance studio. My second family is my dance team. My family and friends are so important to me, even more important than dance. My family, I can't live without them. My friends, I am my real self around them. And my sister, I can be silly, goofy, and weird, and they don't care. They accept me for who I am." Another student wrote, "If I didn't have my family, I wouldn't be raised right. And if I didn't have my friends, I would be a boring person. If I didn't have my religion, I wouldn't know what to do. I would be lost." It's, again, a small objective intervention, but you can tell from these passages that from the student's perspective, it's almost as though they've been preparing their whole life for this intervention because they're bringing to the fore a lifelong value. Even though the physical act is momentary, the psychological act can be powerful, especially at that threatening transition into middle school. So these are 7th graders. If we look at the percentage of students failing the course in which the intervention was given after the first quarter, white students, I'm just collapsing again for ease of presentation, 6% failed roughly regardless of condition. Black students in the control condition, 20% failed their course. By contrast, African American affirmed students, the percentage of African American affirmed students was the percentage of students receiving essentially a D or below in this course was cut in half. And this is why we're so excited about these potential interventions, is because if you think about this kind of thing epidemiologically, if you gave this intervention to 1 million students and it had this kind of effect, it might cut the number of kids failing their course by 100,000. Maybe. In the right time, in the right place, for the right groups, it could have this impact. It won't always have this impact. The effects are conditioned on other things being there already. But if those conditions are there, the effects of these kinds of interventions are very, very promising. This intervention also changed the experience, the objective experience of school for the students. When we looked at the percentage of black students, low-performing black students, placed in the remedial track or retained in grade, black students in the control were 18% enrolled in the remedial track or retained in grade versus 5% in the affirmed condition. And finally, I just want to mention quickly, we have been, thanks to Eric Bettinger and Demetra Logan here at the School of Ed, we've been able to work with both the school and the Student Clearinghouse to follow these students up over time and look at their college enrollment years later. So I'm just going to present some preliminary data looking at this. And what we think can happen at the right time in the right place is that if one transition goes well, the transition through middle school, the next transition could go well, the transition through high school. And if that transition goes well, then I might be more set up to apply for and go to college. The outcomes and advantages of one transition can spill over to affect the next. When we look at the percentage of white students enrolled in college 7 years later, it's 80%. For black students in the control, it's 76%. Whoops. And then for black students in the affirmed condition, 87% are enrolled in college as a consequence of the intervention 7 years later. Now, just in closing, I wanted to emphasize two quick points. One is that these interventions are not panaceas, they're not magic bullets, they're catalysts. They enable the expression of what's already there in the student, in this classroom. The resources and the strengths that are there already can more fully express themselves when psychological threat and is removed and a validating moment and experience is created in the classroom. And the final point I wanted to make before closing is that in a lot of ways, what these interventions do, what effective educators do in word and deed every day in working with their children, which is to send the message, sometimes over and over again, that you belong, you can do it, and you are valued. Thanks.
So I'm going to start the conversation by asking one question and giving the panelists an opportunity to talk to each other and perhaps even ask each other questions, and then we'll open it up for anyone to get into the conversation. So, Claude, you talked about the attribution bias and the fact that and I'll put this in terms of a classroom, the fact that the teacher is likely to see a child's behavior or performance in terms of qualities of the child as opposed to the circumstances or the environment. And you two have done extraordinarily impactful and, as you say, relatively modest interventions that have changed in very substantial ways both the children's lens that they're looking at the classroom through and the psychological mediators of that classroom. So here we have three psychologists who have extraordinary insight and understanding of these processes and have shown through very rigorous research that you can influence them in productive ways. What is your sense of how both your responsibility and the leverage points for creating educational environments broadly spoken across the country and maybe even the world that take advantage of this knowledge and implement not just on a one trial basis that already has profound effects, but on the day-to-day interaction with children, so the kinds of messages that you're providing in these brief interventions become part of the daily messages that they hear? Where are leverage points? What's your advice to a graduate school of education?
Well, we're taking that mission very, very seriously. We're doing research on teacher practices, teacher ways of encouraging, as Geoff is doing on the WISE feedback. We're not at the stage where we have a manual that we can hand to teachers. Here are the practices. Here are ways to institute them in your classroom. But that's something we aspire to in the future.
Anybody want to add anything?
Well, having been immersed in education as I have been for the last couple of years, one other area where I think you can make the argument of the value of these approaches is as ways of looking at some of the dominant policies or policies that dominate education. And for example, we're in an era of where there's a great sense that accountability is critical, and oftentimes that can translate into strategies of teaching, the curriculum, the school organization, and so forth that will make a great deal of sense from the standpoint of an observer, that I'm looking at that kid has certain needs, and my first mission here is to get that kid to be able to read and to get that kid to, and I focus in on that from the standpoint of that commitment. But from the standpoint of the kid, the activity that's involved there might send a very different message than what a teacher or a school or a country would like to send. And so I think I just raise that because that's something I think a lot about. Just the more and more immersion I have in the world of education, that this perspective needs to kind of be lifted up and put into play with the dominant discourse in education. I think that would help further it a great deal.
So some of the high stakes testing is putting pressure on teachers, and the practices may be fostering the very psychological states that we're trying to.
Claude, you talked about the child sees or experiences life through both an identity lens and other psychological needs that you've talked about, but the teacher tends to see the child from the perspective of perhaps a group or a high performer, a low performer, or what else. Are there ways in which we can help teachers to change that attribution bias so they see their classroom through the eyes of their student and the student's experience?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. One thing is we did an experiment inspired by Carol's work once, where because teachers are often under stereotype threat. And it's a particularly powerful form of stereotype threat in that they can worry when they're dealing with kids who are from underserved, stigmatized, stereotyped populations. That if they make a mistake or they don't do well, the student doesn't do well, it's going to reflect back on them, that they're going to be seen in terms of the stereotype in our society as maybe insensitive or even racist. So it can be a very loaded thing, teaching in an American diverse classroom for teachers as well as students. They have these reciprocating forms of stereotype threat. So one ambition has been to help that. And one of the strategies that has worked in our lab, this is years ago since I haven't been in my lab in many years.
But you've been writing books.
I did that. Was to have the teachers think of their experience with students as learning opportunities and not so much as a fixed thing. If you think of the thing that you're worried about being seen in terms of as a fixed trait, and you don't want to, so you're deflecting being seen that way because you think if you are seen that well, you'll be forever seen that way, or it becomes very loaded, so you start to perform not being that way. It's a very elaborate kind of dance that goes on, but if you can kind of relax and see the experience more as, look, nobody knows how to do this perfectly, and this is an opportunity to learn. I'm going to learn from my students. I'm going to let them tell me some things. I'm going to set this whole thing in play in a different way. Then teachers and participants in our research relax tremendously, so that and we're able to get much closer together and function together. So I think having American teachers understand how much there is to learn about the things we're talking about is a critical first step in a new era of approach here.
I'd like to echo that. I think teachers need a growth mindset about themselves as teachers.
Yeah.
And I like to tell teachers, every child has something to teach you. And that kind of transforms their way of, as you're saying, of viewing and dealing with their students.
I was just going to say, although, as you pointed out, that children come in with their own limited bandwidth because of all the other stresses in their lives, teachers have limited bandwidth in even hearing those messages sometimes because of the accountability stress and the other things that we're pushing in their face.
Yeah. I was just going to add, it'd be great to see more partnerships between, as is going on here, between educators and education researchers and social psychologists. So my sense is that this perspective on education and motivation is not out there as much as it could or should be. Not represented in teacher preparation programs as much as it could or it should be. And I think working as a team with other researchers and practitioners sitting at the same table to kind of talk, sort of find out what we can, as we've learned a lot in designing these interventions from teachers, I think teachers could also learn a lot about how to handle these difficult situations, especially a diverse classroom with useful tools of the sort that we've all, and many others have been developing. I also, the other point is that I think in a lot of ways there's this abstraction gap that there's teachers and practitioners and all of us understand that a sense of belonging, a sense of sort of efficacy on the part of the student, potential is very important. We kind of get that, but what we don't get is how to bring those states about. And one of the things that social psychology of late has really helped with is developing a technology of how to, technology is the wrong word, but tools, specific concrete tools that can help further those goals of encouraging these states of mind in students that in the right circumstances can make all the difference. So I think that's those are sort of 2 points that I'd supplement what you guys said with.
Thinking of the research on teacher change, one of the things that comes out very clearly in that research is that teachers' basic beliefs about kids are fundamentally important. And so whatever we can teach them in terms of strategies won't have much of a weight if we can't also dislodge those basic beliefs. So if the teacher doesn't really believe that all kids can learn, then we can give them 100 tools to convey that to students, but if they don't believe it, they won't convey it. And so I think another challenge is to really change some fundamental beliefs that are have very deep
Roots.
hold in our culture. I'm going to open this up now to, I assume that there's a
There's a microphone.
microphone. So I,
Could you stand and introduce yourself, please? Great.
Good evening, my name is Renee Richard. I have a mentoring program for girls of color. It's called Cinnamon Girl. And as I see the presentation and a lot of your philosophies or your research, I realize that when my girls come to the mentoring program, I take them regardless of their grades. And then I say, we work with highly motivated girls. And they hear this constantly, and people wonder, well, Renee, how come you have so much success? And I really didn't realize that perhaps me telling the girls they have so much potential and constantly filling their minds with these positive messages that it's really having an effect. But moreover, I would like for the panel to give me good, solid information as how I can continue to educate my girls about stereotype threat without laying out some of the negativity. I want to do it in such a positive way, but I need to empower them, and I just need some good pointers as to how we can educate our youth so that just to educate them a little bit more about this. This is coming more from the educator's perspective, and I'm working directly with the youth.
Well, I think you saw some amazing interventions that would be helpful, that would generalize to the situation that you're talking about. There are some others too that I think can be helpful in reducing something like stereotype threat. One that I don't think is as obvious as it could be is cross-group interactions and experiences. That when you get to talk to people about personal things that are and they're from different backgrounds, I'll put it that way, you learn something, which is that you learn what's common, that a lot of your experience is common to a lot of different people. And the identity you have isn't quite as big a deal maybe as you might otherwise think it to be. It can be, but it might, and that relaxes the person and takes some of this, the stereotype threat is impairing and affecting kids by pressuring them to be vigilant all the time as to what you're vigilant, you're paying attention, what's happening, what's that mean, why did they say that, what's this? Because you're trying to test the hypothesis about whether you're going to be seen that way or treated that way. So it can induce a real preoccupation, which becomes itself a bandwidth reducing thing. And that kind of an experience seems almost unrelated, but what it does is give the person a very different informational basis about how to interpret themselves, how to interpret the meaning of their identities, and it relaxes these kind of pressures. So that's a strategy. Chapter 9 and all of this book has a bunch of others.
Yes, I'm Claude Goldenberg here in the School of Education. I want to thank our panelists for a really stimulating, truly privileged to be listening to all of you, all four of you tonight. So thanks very much for that. Claude, you mentioned that we are sort of on the brink of a new era, a new type of intervention. in our quest to at least mitigate the achievement gap. But I'd suggest that there is at least one precedent for this type of intervention. The locus and control research, the attribution theory research, the expectancy effects, Pygmalion in the classroom. I mean, that washed over like a tidal wave in American education, culminating programs with real manuals, teacher expectations and student achievement. And now expectations, is part of the argot of education, right? You can't talk about educators to educators, with educators, without talking about expectations. Now, I would suggest that that's had much more effect at the level of rhetoric than actually at the level of results. So my question is this a reasonable precedent to be looking at? And if so, what lessons could we learn from that precedent about this new type of intervention?
Boy, that's a good question, Claude. My namesake. I've never been in a school where there's another person named Claude. So. But I think, we would certainly hope that as this era gets launched, and that's how I would characterize what's going on, is that there is a broadening amount of attention to these kind of approaches, because the data have been compelling, and I would argue that the data have been compelling in a way that maybe the earlier era, the data weren't quite as compelling and weren't quite as consistent, and there weren't quite as big an army of researchers focused on it. So I wouldn't overdraw that, but I think that is a factor in launching this era. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind about that. But I would, and maybe this is not the moment to go into this, but there is the question of generalization and how a given effect, to what circumstance does it generalize. And I think a great deal of the ability of this approach to be effective in practice and in policy will depend on the era where we begin to understand the moderators of these effects, the circumstantial moderators of these effects. I mean, Geoff and I have talked about this, Carol and I have talked about this for years. You can get this effect, these things work in situations where you've got good schooling underneath it, but you've just got these identity issues but if you don't have good schooling underneath it, maybe you won't get these kind of effects. So as these effects go forward, as this era gets launched, I hope that we will have a little bit more understanding of the need to understand moderation and to be patient with this, that we're going to have to be as scientific and systematic about accumulating knowledge of these moderators as we are knowledge of these basic kinds of effects. So
And I'd like to say that, were you going to say something?
I was, but I'll go after you.
Oh.
Ladies first. Go ahead.
All right, in that case, I think that the locus of control, expectancy, was a very rich research tradition, but there was little attention to how to translate that into practice. And I believe that the expectancy effect set the stage for the self-esteem movement, set the stage for the lavish ability praise that was so widely dispensed. That's why we think it's critical to test specific practices that we think might embody the variables we study.
Yeah, one of the frustrating things is the scaling up process. So how do you go from these small scale existence proofs to affect a school district or even a whole country? That turns out to be a very tricky question, and so tricky that I think, as your previous example suggests, we've failed in the past, or social psychologists and psychologists have failed somewhat in the past in some cases. I think one of the problems, or one of the key issues, is we need to understand why an intervention works, how it works, and when it works, as both Carol and Claude were saying. Because otherwise what happens is the rhetoric gets scaled up, but the details get left behind.
The psychological essence.
The psychological essence. So high standards is a good example of that, okay, so we impose high standards and try to instill high expectations in the students for their success, but we don't really have specific details on how you do that, on how you bring about high expectations in the student. Part of the problem is how the research is framed is in terms of the sort of conceptual variable of high expectations rather than in terms of specific practices that bring about high expectations. When Rosenthal wrote about expectations, one of the things he emphasized a lot is the importance of teacher affect, like the teacher giving positive nonverbals to the kids so that they feel a sense of rapport, and the importance of attention, that the teacher gives a lot of attention to students and thereby helps lift them to the higher expectations and sends the message that you're worth the effort. And so these little details are easy to miss. And if they're not fully understood, the scaling up process risks leaving a lot of them behind.
But definitely the science can help us understand these details, but there are some bigger cultural issues, racism, for example, that are deeply rooted in the society. And I think we can't not face up to those deeper cultural issues because you can only go so far in changing behavior without changing that basic set of beliefs and values.
Definitely.
I'm going to invoke executive privilege and make a comment/question. My name is Mitchell Stevens. With Candace Till and Roy P., I co-convene the co-sponsor of this forum, Education's Digital Future. And I was having a kind of deja vu experience listening to you all because it's all too good to be true. We have a small handful of modest, brilliantly conceived interventions, and all the numbers move in the right direction to a miraculous degree. And I've been participating in many conversations which also make something called online learning sound too good to be true. And there are quite a few researchers in this room who think if we take your too good to be true and combine it with our too good to be true, specifically online learning, most of our educational problems are going to be mitigated. So I was hoping to. I hadn't thought about that affinity yet. I know a lot of people who are interested in online learning are knocking on your collective doors, and so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about possibilities and risks at the intersection of the research traditions that you guys are carrying forward and the whole new waves of interest in that research that are being brought about through online learning.
I don't know, one immediate response that comes to mind is an analogy to, there's a book called The Cancer, the Emperor of Maladies. I don't know if you've seen this, and it's a fascinating story of the history of cancer research. And I keep thinking about it as an analogy to the kind of research that we're doing, that there's a tremendous need to have a solution and to be working hard to make progress, a tremendous need. But it can sometimes overwhelm the actual the level of the science, the degree, the sophistication, the science. It can push it too far, push it too fast, get people committed to treatments and so on too early, have all kinds of effects like that out of a sense of urgency. And I think education is quite analogous to that. We have a great sense of urgency, a great need to make progress on these things. We're haunted by these achievement gaps. We're haunted by these growing inequalities in performance. They threaten, the fabric of our society, and we want to make progress in a hurry. And so I think rightfully we're looking for good avenues to go down. I think the art here, though, is to have the patience to go down these roads carefully. And again, I won't detail that book, The Emperor of Maladies, here, because it's pretty gruesome. But you get some very vivid pictures of what happens if you go too fast and you get out ahead of things. And again, I feel a little bit about some of our accountability movements and so on like that they, you get a little progress and then you get a big regression.
At the same time,
good, we're going to disagree.
no, our team has been very excited about the potential for online learning. And I see some of the people in this room. We've worked with the Khan Academy, infusing growth mindset encouragement into the math lessons. Like remember, every time you work on a hard math problem, you grow your math brain, you get smarter math, etc. And we found greater number of problems solved correctly in the unit with those encouraging statements, but also we found afterwards more taking of subsequent units and higher performance on those subsequent units. So we're excited. I've been collaborating with a game scientist. We made an online math game that had a growth mindset incentive system where the students were rewarded not for getting the problem right, but for taking on challenge, sticking to it, trying many strategies. And we found that many more of the low and medium achievers stayed in that game than in the regular game that simply rewarded you for quickly going through the level. So we're really excited about how to bring together what we know with these new platforms. We're only at the beginning. And I think one reason we're doing it is we want it to be done with kind of what Geoff was saying, a real understanding of what the principles are that we're trying to bring to bear.
Yeah, another opportunity for online learning is spreading some of the practices and principles to teachers as well, so they think differently about student motivation.
Hi, my name is Shikha Saxena. First of all, thanks for a very informative session, and I do plan to apply some of the strategies on my toddler. Hopefully that will work. And my question is really related to the digital process that we are now embarking on in a big way as far as education is concerned. How do we really study these stereotypes in a digital environment? How do we understand these stereotypes when the person is not in front of us? And how do we then apply these interventions and embed them in the learning process? And are they going to be personalized? Can they be customized to an individual's need? Or are they, broader and can be applied to a group? So how does the digital environment really, impact what this research can do? Because it can do a lot, and that is totally understandable. That's the question. Thank you.
I'm looking at you because
You've actually done this,
You've
Carol.
actually done this, but
I have.
You just described what you were doing with the Khan Academy.
yeah.
Oh, right, but I
But it
think she
wasn't
was asking
individualized.
how do we deal with stereotype threat and such within the digital.
Well, one thing I
environment.
always tell people is that among the strategies to reduce stereotype threat is mindset.
Yes.
Because I think it inherently reduces.
Yeah, we actually
We're
do
supposed
have
to be
that.
on it.
We do have that research.
Got it on that.
Yes, we do have research showing that. The growth mindset.
I think some of the, I
Yeah.
would go out on a bit of a limb and say that some of the areas where mindset interventions are most powerful are in areas where stereotype threat is the problem, and by reducing that it can have.
And
effects.
we have shown in a couple of studies that it does mitigate stereotype threat because a negative stereotype says it's fixed and your group doesn't have it. And if you have a fixed mindset already, some people have it, some don't, you're more vulnerable. But if you believe, wait a minute, you get this thing, you don't just have it, you get these skills by learning and failing and learning more, then the stereotype it loses some of its bite.
I think another way to reduce anxiety about performance related to stereotype threat is providing opportunities for students to keep working on it until they get it right. And most of the productive games that I've seen and effective online strategies have had that quality where you don't get, it's not public, and so if you make mistakes you can just fix it, or you just keep plugging away until you meet a certain standard and can go on. And so it relieves that anxiety of having to produce some sort of performance that people are going to evaluate you by.
I'm Tom Ehrlich from the School of Education. The evidence you present is stunningly impressive for K-12 students. Is there evidence that interventions along the lines you suggest is also workable for adult learners?
If you say college learners,
Community college.
Yeah, there's several studies with college-age students in higher education. So some labs, including ours, have done affirmation interventions as well as wise criticism interventions among college students, and those seem to duplicate the same effects that we observe in middle school, though the actual sort of content of the intervention needs to be changed to be more suitable for an adult population. I think, and then Greg Walton here at the psychology department has also spent a lot of time developing interventions based on psychology and identity threat to help alleviate those concerns in higher education. One general point, I think, is that what these kinds of interventions do oftentimes isn't tied so much to a specific developmental stage as much as it is to transitions. And so I think that there are sort of these points where people are often asking themselves more loudly the question, do I belong? Can I do it? And those are sort of, and the places that they're doing that most often, I think, are entry points. You know, when the standards rise abruptly, it's a new environment, and it's a kind of highly ambiguous situation. And these questions sort of just assert themselves. And I think a lot of the interventions that are out there in social psychology really speak well to how to ease the psychological costs of transitions and make those costs less persistent. So transitions in higher education, middle school or high school.
One back here.
Hi, I'm Carol Muller, Executive Director of Wise Ventures at Stanford University, and I've been working for many years on a variety of interventions to advance equity in STEM fields in particular at various levels, and have loved and read many of your papers and books. So I think it's really wonderful research that helps us illuminate what steps we might be able to take in terms of action to make improvements. It strikes me that what's missing from this fantastic sort of panel, putting all these threads together, is bias and all the research about various kinds of biases, errors in judgment that we make without really thinking about it, and especially the subtle and implicit bias. And I'm wondering, you know, I was mulling that over and thinking, well, the problem with bias is it puts people off or engenders a defensive reaction sometimes in a way that identity motivation and stereotype threat may not. But if we really want to make widespread change and reach people to get them in a growth mindset, it seems like part of that is examining your cultural biases and your awareness of things that are very implicit rather than explicit. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that as part of the sort of translational strategy. And I was also thinking there's got to be a great series of TED Talks in here that could just go viral. So I hope you'll consider that, because I think as we look at translating research into practice, what we realize is you have to do a lot of it, and it has to be ongoing, and it takes people a long time before they even hear you through the cacophony of everything that's out there. Thank you.
Anybody want to?
Well, I'll try something there. 'Cause I think bias is a big deal. It's our history, and stereotypes, I think, hold or capture part of our history. But sometimes I think, you know, without diminishing the importance of bias in schooling situations, I think this is in part what Deborah was just saying. There are these deep-rooted assumptions and that guide our perceptions of things. So whenever you hand out an essay, and it's the same essay, but there's a woman's name on it versus a man's name on it, you tend to get a difference of evaluation. It's reflecting the impact of gender on the evaluation of the work. You can just reliably do these studies right into the present era and get these kind of effects. So So biases, I think, are very important in the world we're trying to generalize to in a big way. Sometimes I think we mistake things that are more like reactions to stereotype threat as bias when they're not really biased. They're and not really driven by prejudice in general.
Mm-hmm.
They're driven by the desire not to ever be seen as prejudiced.
Yes.
Not to ever make a mistake that would ever cause that to happen.
Yeah.
And that can lead to a kind of evasion and a kind of avoidance, a kind of segregation of experience and friendship networks, and that looks like it's driven by bias, but it's actually driven by
Fear of
fear.
looking biased.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just only complicates this world one step more. But you were going to say something? I don't know.
I was going to say our mutual student Priyanka Carr showed in her dissertation that this fear of looking biased mimicked bias, like characteristic by characteristic, avoidance of interracial interactions, anxiety in interracial interactions.
Or low expectations.
Yeah.
Low expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that none of us wants anyone to take away from these talks is the idea that, well, because these psychological interventions work, that means that other approaches,
Right.
structural reforms, educational interventions for teachers shouldn't be done. None of us believe that. And in fact, I think a lot of the interventions we do are conditional on the environment, the classroom environment, being one in which learning can occur. Though there may be some level of bias, it's a place where people can grow and can seize opportunities for growth. If that weren't the case, you could imagine that at least some of these interventions, like wise criticism, perhaps affirmation, perhaps growth mindset, they might cause demoralization. Because if I find myself sort of believing in my growth, but in an environment that continually thwarts it, that would be an even more psychologically aversive situation, possibly. So that's why one huge issue that I want to make very clear is that structural reform, reducing bias and prejudice is absolutely essential, and it's in partnership with those approaches that psychological interventions can be sort of one other piece of the puzzle. Kent Harbor has some nice data, for instance, showing that a positive feedback bias, where teachers overpraise minority students for mediocre work and instantiate this message of low expectations. That's the kind of thing that also needs to be addressed.
Here, well said.
But also teachers saying to children, oh, just keep trying, you will get smart, but
No,
they keep
but not-
failing
They keep
because
failing.
the school classroom is set up so that there's no real possibility for them to succeed.
Where they don't
It
get the
is-
criticism or the feedback they need to get better, the scaffolding.
Oh, good, because many of us in this room and outside this room have committed their lives to these big structural reforms and fundamentally influencing teacher education and the way
I like
schools
to
are
say-
organized. And so I just want to make sure that
Yeah.
we're all still going to be working together.
Yes, and I like to say, in the meantime, while you're doing these really important, very large-scale undertakings,
You keep plugging away
Yeah.
and getting those details right so that we know how to help teachers be as good as they can be.
I think the Harlem Children's Zone is a good example of the right way. They could really benefit from listening to us, because we would add to the tremendous work they do at the level of structural support, and family support, community support. They really are building in these necessary blocks of success, and then if they listen to us, they'd even be.
I think we just need to listen to each other and keep working
There we go.
together. we clearly have a lot of work to do. I just want to say to all of you, thank you for being here. A very special thanks to our fabulous panelists. And I I'm also really glad that the roof didn't fall in. So have a good evening.